And welcome back to another episode here at the Healthcare Business Network. I'm your host, Ron Nyman, and welcome to the place where business and healthcare is our business. I want to welcome our audience here once again at hbnradioshow.com. That's hbnradioshow.com. And this week, we are going to be talking about privacy breaches again, but we're going to be taking a slightly different tack on it this week. We're going to be talking about the number and the magnitude of privacy breaches that have gone on since 2003, since the HIPAA regulations were enacted. And one of the most fascinating things that we get questions about from our audience out there is, well, if I just have a breach that affects only 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 10 patients, 50 patients, not too big, what kind of impact is it going to have on my practice? And is the government going to be very harsh with me? Well, we've got a wonderful guest expert today to discuss just that very issue. And his name is Dennis Melamed. Dennis is the president of Melamed LLC, which is a publishing and regulatory research and consulting firm. Dennis is also the editor and publisher of Health Information Privacy Security Alert, which is a compliance newsletter focused on all patient data stewardship issues. More on that later. We'll talk more about Dennis's newsletter. Dennis is also one of the authors of a recent series of white papers and regulatory analyses on patient consent and health information exchanges for the National Governors Association's State Alliance for e-Health. And in addition to many of the other things that Dennis does, he works on producing many compliance webinars, and also he's an adjunct professor at the Drexel College of Medicine in Philadelphia, where he teaches graduate courses on patient data stewardship and current issues in biomedical regulation. I want to take the proud opportunity to welcome Dennis to the Healthcare Business Network. Dennis, wonderful to have you on board.
Well, thanks for having me. I look forward to a nice discussion.
Absolutely. Well, I guess, Dennis, really where I wanted to start with all of this was, since 2003, how many investigations for privacy breaches, to your knowledge, have there been?
Oh, well, we've been tracking that number for quite a while, but it's important to make a distinction. Nothing in the medical privacy and data security arena is that simple. We first started off with the HIPAA privacy and security rules, which did not discuss breaches at all. And I'll get into that in a moment. So what we were talking about were new rules to talk about how we use and protect data. That was a very narrow universe. It's just medical providers, and insurers and clearinghouses, a lot of people who handle medical data aren't covered by this. But the first program, the only program that I'm aware of really that's focused on privacy complaints started with the Office for Civil Rights in 2003 when the HIPAA privacy rule first went into effect. So we've had a bunch of years of looking at this. So up to now, as of last month, we've had over 57,000 complaints lodged with the Office for Civil Rights alleging some sort of privacy violation. Now, that sounds like a lot, but as I go through this a little bit, you're going to see, wow, in my mind, it's really quite a remarkable number about how low it is. Out of that 57,300 or so, about a third of those fell within the jurisdiction of the federal government and HIPAA to act on. So that meant that a lot of people were making complaints about things that weren't medical privacy complaints that anybody could do anything about on the federal level.
So you're saying, really, if you're saying only a third that the government were really interested in looking at, that's probably about, 19,000 complaints?
That's about 19,000. And it wasn't that they weren't interested. Those are the ones that fell within their legal authority. Now, out of those, about 12,500 required some sort of response or action from the healthcare provider or the health plan or the clearinghouse. So we're talking about, out of the total complaints that they've received, only 22% have required some change in behavior from a covered entity, a healthcare provider or a health insurer or clearinghouse. That meant another 6,500 investigations occurred where there was no violation. Now, and that meant also 33,000, again, had nothing to do with HIPAA. The interesting thing here, when you think about these numbers, I always imagine how many millions upon millions of patient-doctor healthcare system interactions there have occurred, and then you put that in the context of 50 or so thousand complaints about which most of them aren't covered by HIPAA, it's really kind of a remarkably small number.
Now, how many individuals would you estimate, Dennis, are covered by these privacy breaches? That 22% that you were talking about before, which required investigations?
Okay, those were not breaches.
They were not breaches.
They were not. Those were violations of the rules. What HIPAA did, the privacy rule did, and what the courts have consistently found, is that really calling it a privacy rule isn't really what's going on here. Courts have typically interpreted the privacy rule as creating a system for releasing data. And in that regard, when you look at court cases that have involved HIPAA, it really has privacy, patient rights are involved, but really when you start looking at liability and things like that, it's really been, have you violated the rules for release, the process by which you decide to maintain and release and share information. Now, we do have numbers on the breach. The breach notification law that was part of the economic stimulus package. A lot of people think that was part of healthcare reform. It was actually part of the economic stimulus package. We do have some numbers there. They're relatively new, though. And as of last month, we had about 225 events of reportable breaches. And those are breaches that were thought to have affected more than 500 patients.
Now, this is reporting
this
since
goes
when?
back to last February.
Okay,
we started coming out with these numbers.
Okay, so since last February 2010 up to now, so we're looking into February 2011, 1 year really.
Well, actually a little over, but yeah, about that. We're going into our first year.
So you're talking about 225 events here.
Yeah, a couple of interesting things. We have some total estimated numbers of how many people were affected by that, and actually they dropped, which raises some interesting questions. Approximately 6,067,000 people were estimated to have been affected by these breaches, and I'll get into what affected by means in a minute. But that fell by 300,000, and the reason is the way the rule works and the way the Office for Civil Rights, which is within HHS, which is also responsible for enforcing that as well, there's such a urgency to report that sometimes you just don't know the full extent. And so there've been some revisions to the numbers to reduce them because one breach or so did not affect as many people. So you're going to see some variation in the numbers. So they're just good for general numbers.
Right. Now, you answered this next question, but I wanted to go back into it. The government entity that's primarily responsible for handling these investigations would be OCR, right? The Office of Civil Rights.
For right now, the primary agency is the Office for Civil Rights. But I would also caution you to recognize that the Federal Trade Commission has played a role in medical privacy, and one of the things that HITECH did, which was part of the economic stimulus package, was give state attorney generals more power under HIPAA. Although to me that hasn't played out very forcefully. State attorney generals have had lots of authority to go after medical privacy breaches well before HIPAA under their own laws, and really haven't availed themselves of that. But the Federal Trade Commission has taken steps, and not so much from a privacy perspective. But this breach law also highlights the fact that a lot of breaches would not necessarily also fall under privacy, but typically fall under security violations. And the Federal Trade Commission has gone after some healthcare entities for not living up to their promises to maintain the security of their data over the last 10 or 12 years. And we're going to see the Federal Trade Commission, which has steadfastly not gone into anywhere near Department of Health and Human Services jurisdiction here, but they're going to have jurisdiction over personal health records, which are records, the medical records that are going to be maintained by the consumer, the patient. We're not sure how that's going to play out in the way all of this goes through because we're very early in the process. But they're going to be another player. But for right now, for healthcare purposes, the Office for Civil Rights is the main player.
Dennis, we're going to take a quick break from our friends here at MediStar. When we get back, we're going to talk more on this subject. We had some additional questions. We wanted to talk to Dennis about high breach cases where there are a lot of patients affected versus cases under 500. So we'll be back in a minute on the Healthcare Business Network.